After America is made on the lands of the Kure, Wurrung, Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, we acknowledge that they and their ancestors have cared for the lands, rivers and sea, and all living creatures for thousands of generations. We pay our respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded.
We are in a battle for the soul of America.
This is a fraud on the American public.
Hi, I'm Emma Shortis, and this is After America. Donald Trump's authoritarianism might be shocking, but it shouldn't be surprising, because he usually tells us what he's going to do. So when Trump announced that he was sending the National Guard into DC, for example, he told us what would come next.
We have other cities also that are bad, very bad. You look at Chicago, how bad it is. You look at Los Angeles, how bad it is. We have other cities that are very bad. New York has a problem. And then you have, of course, Baltimore and Oakland. We don't even mention that anymore. They're so far gone. We're not going to let it happen. We're not going to lose our cities over this.
What comes next is Chicago. On Monday, reports emerged that the Pentagon is drawing up plans to send in the National Guard. And Trump's authoritarianism isn't isolated to domestic politics. We see that in his alignment with other authoritarian leaders like Vladimir Putin. We see it in his support, sometimes direct and sometimes indirect, for empire building and the taking of territory by force, be it by Putin's Russia or Netanyahu's Israel. But this imperial revival is meeting resistance, both on the ground and in the international arena. In Australia over the weekend, tens, possibly hundreds of thousands of people turned out into the streets to protest Israel's war on Palestine and to call for more action from the international community to protect Palestinians. With me to talk about Australia's relationship with Israel, what the Trump-Putin talks could mean for the Middle East, and the state of American democracy, is Allan Behm, Special Advisor in International Affairs here at the Australia Institute. Hi, Allan. Thank you for coming back on the show.
Well, good afternoon, Emma. Lovely to talk to you as ever.
Always. Allan, there is a lot happening. We've got a lot to get through, so let's jump straight in. As we are recording, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has come on Australian TV last night and is spending an awful lot of his time attacking the Australian government and the Australian Prime Minister in particular. Last night, during that interview, he called Australian recognition of Palestinian statehood appeasement. So there's some very strong language being thrown around. What do you make of it all?
Look, I'm not surprised at what Benjamin Netanyahu is doing and what he's saying, not the slightest bit, because he is cornered. He's fighting for his life. And in a funny way, Australia has enough international prominence to make it worth attacking, but at very low cost. So he can abuse Anthony Albanese and Penny Wong. Nobody's going to pay all that much attention to it, but he's out there heckling them because he is increasingly isolated internationally. So in a way, what he's really doing is using Australia as a relief valve because we have credibility, and the more he attacks that credibility, the more he believes that he can maintain what's left of his domestic traction. I'm, in fact, far from being offended by what Netanyahu is saying. If I'd been Albanese or Wong, I'd be simply saying, well, he would say that, wouldn't he? Because he's cornered, he's isolated, and all he can do is protest and look weak. And that's exactly what he's doing well.
Yeah, I mean, for what it's worth, I think you're right. It was a fairly strong indication for me that the interview that he did on Sky, didn't rate very highly on ABC News or in much of the news coverage the next morning. And I think that's a pretty strong indication of that weakness that you described.
On Mr. Netanyahu's official account on the social media platform X, he posted that history will remember Anthony Albanese as a weak leader, one who betrayed Israel and abandoned Australia's Jewish community.
I don't take these things personally. I engage with people diplomatics had similar things to say about other leaders.
Strength is not measured by how many people you can blow up or how many children you can leave hungry.
The Australian government seems to have understood that very clearly as well, and seems to be changing its response to what the Israeli government is doing more broadly, partly because of that change in community sentiment. So the Prime Minister's response has been quite strong to what Netanyahu has been saying. Minister Tony Burke even went so far as to retort that to an accusation of weakness, that strength is not measured by how many people you can blow up. This does seem like a change in language, at least. How well do you think the Australian government is handling this?
Look, I think the Australian government is handling it pretty well. I think they did get a fair bit of encouragement, actually, from the protest in Sydney across the bridge, because that was such a broad-based protest. There were young people, old people, virtually every ethnic community in Australia was in some way represented there. There were people pushing prams. There was a huge number of women who were protesting about the shocking suffering of women and children in Palestine and in Gaza more particularly. So I think that was a very big cue and a little bit of a circuit breaker politically, in the same way as the moratorium marches were in Australia back in 1969. So I think that there has been a change both in the content and the tone of the government's responses to Palestine and its responses to the brutality of Israel's military actions in Palestine.
The community is quite obviously increasingly clear about this issue, exactly as you described, but it still appears that the political class, if we can call it that, and corporate Australia are still making a mess of this issue. So last week, at the time of recording, the Bendigo Writers' Festival in Victoria was effectively cancelled as writers refused to sign a code of conduct that was clearly aimed at suppressing speech on Palestine and withdrew from the festival. Guardian Australia has reported that during protests at the University of Melbourne, the university acted inappropriately in using Wi-Fi systems to surveil protesters. Why do you think it is that so many of our institutions are still so out of step with their own communities on this?
It is a difficult issue, Emma. It's not surprising to me that there's a lot of confusion about what the principles and issues are that make it such a confusing issue. And I think it's fair to say that some of the proponents for the policies which both Melbourne and La Trobe universities have endorsed, and that's essentially a definition of anti-Semitism which makes a contextual link between Zionism, the Jewish religion, Israel, and Prime Minister Netanyahu. So if you conflate all of those things and you wish to attack the policies of Israel, it becomes very difficult to manage the boundary between Israel, the Jewish religion, and Zionism. And so they're very frightened of making a mistake, of being caught up legally, of being threatened with lawsuits, because certainly the more conservative Jewish community organisations in Australia are quite happy to threaten lawsuits and accuse people of defamation or anti-Semitism on what I personally consider are fairly flimsy grounds, because categorically all of those four things are quite separate. And you should be able to talk about Prime Minister Netanyahu and the state of Israel without thinking that they're the same thing. And certainly at least half of the voting population of Israel don't think they're the same thing. And yet we're caught up with that. I think they're wanting actually to be prim and proper. They're actually being rather silly, because they should be smart enough to steer their way through those concepts. And that is essentially what the 50 or so individuals who said, hey, we're not going to be bound by this code of conduct in Bendigo. We know how to have a decent, respectful conversation about the relationship between Israel and Zionism, for example. We don't need to be tutored on this. We're grown-ups and adults. And as you probably know, I'm a member of a Writers' Festival board myself, and we've reviewed our own practices. We don't call it something as quite as stentorian as code of conduct, sort of a bit like rules of war or sort of law of war. We just call it principles of respectful discourse. And we don't think it's easy to steer through it, but we do think that participants in writers' conference or protesters or whatever else are quite good at working out the differences between these things and being respectful towards the proponents of any view, for most of the time at least. So I just think that they've made a huge sort of mountain out of what is essentially quite a small molehill if they were just to distinguish out the principal conceptual features of the problem that they're dealing with. And it is worth noting, I think, just in passing, Emma, that there are a number of quite different groups that speak on behalf broadly of the Australian Jewish community, and those groups aren't in agreement, and yet they're able to sustain their arguments without having mutually to accuse each other of anti-Semitism. And indeed, if people take the trouble to look at letters to the editor, and I'm one of those sad people who still does that from time to time, you will find that there are quite a lot of letters by both people who are Jewish and non-Jewish that are talking about the rights of Palestinians on the one hand and talking about the key features of Jewish identity on the other. And you'll have people who are practicing Jews who will say that their identity is not defined by that particular definition of anti-Semitism that prevents them from talking perhaps about Zionism. I just think it requires respect and goodwill to drive through that rather than strictures and pressures on people's otherwise so-called behaviour.
There'll be some land swapping going on. I know that through Russia and through conversations with everybody to the good, for the good of Ukraine. Good stuff, not bad stuff. Also, some bad stuff for both. So there's good and there's bad.
If the Ukrainians are willing to say something on territory that brings the conflict to the close, we're not going to stop them. We're also not going to force them because it's not our country.
This is exactly the trap that Russia wants us to walk into. I mean, the discussion all about what Ukraine should give up. We are forgetting that Russia hasn't made one single concession, and they are the ones who are the aggressor here.
Speaking, I guess, of behaviours, Allan, Netanyahu's using a lot of these accusations of anti-Semitism, even accusations of appeasement, direct invocation of Nazism. It seems almost as cover for what he and his government are actually doing in Palestine, in Gaza and in the West Bank, and is being facilitated, of course, by the US president, by Donald Trump. Trump, of course, in the last, week or couple of weeks has not been particularly focused on Israel or Palestine. He's been focused on Putin and Russia and Ukraine. But these things are all related, aren't they?
Well, they are related, Emma, because the United States remains a major international player. And the President of the United States, extraordinary person that he is, very sort of temperamental and impetuous, really, has an enormous agency internationally. And so governments and leaders steer by what the US does because it's got huge power, economic power, military power, cultural power, political power, strategic power. So in those senses, of course, you've got to pay attention to what the Americans say. And Netanyahu, no less than anybody else. But here's something that I think is particularly interesting about the conversation that Trump had with Putin in Anchorage just the week before last. And I think Netanyahu has paid a lot of attention to that conversation And not only has he taken comfort from it, but I think also a measure of legitimacy for what he's actually doing on the ground now in Palestine. It seems to me, at least, that the tentative agreement, if that's what one can call it, between Putin and Trump revolved around whether or not the consolidation of territorial gains by Russia in the eastern part of Ukraine is the precursor to peace negotiations, or whether peace negotiations precede the establishment of either a return to old boundaries or the construction of new ones. I think where Trump and Putin ended up was that a peace agreement, a cessation of hostilities, will be predicated upon recognition of Russia's territorial gains. And I think that that is exactly what Netanyahu wants for Israel. He wants the gains that Israel has made, not just in Palestine, which is why I think the insertion now and occupation of Gaza becomes such a critical strategic issue for him, but I think also West Bank and the Golan Heights. I mean, we've forgotten about the collapse of Syria, and the first thing that Israeli army did was to go into the Golan Heights in case some terrorists came across the border and started creating problems. I mean, it had nothing to do with terrorists, really. It had to do with a further opportunity for Israel to enhance its security in the Golan Heights. For understandable reasons, by the way, but you can negotiate that. You don't have to occupy. So I think what might be at stake here is the beginnings of a legitimised set of territorial claims as the precursor for some form of settlement in Palestine, which will mean that we no longer have to look back to the Accords of 1967, but substantiate changes that have taken place since then, but particularly in the West Bank and in Gaza. So I see it in somewhat different terms. I see it myself in strategic terms, much less in political terms, because, as I say, I think Netanyahu is taking cover behind the sort of agreement that Trump and Putin made in Anchorage. I hope that's not too far-fetched an idea, but I certainly think his actions tend to substantiate that sort of thinking.
Absolutely, and that it is all part of an imperial revival being led, I think, by the Trump presidency. Just, I mean, on that, Allan, if we look more closely at Russia and Ukraine, can I draw from what you just said that you are not particularly optimistic at Trump's efforts to broker a peace between Russia and Ukraine? You know, do you think he's going to get that trilateral meeting between himself and Putin and Zelensky, and will it matter if he does?
It's sort of, I need a crystal ball for that one because Zelensky himself, I think, is a very shrewd and wily player, and he may do some things that he said he won't do in order to maximise the best possible outcome, as he sees it, for Ukraine. Overall, Ukraine's position is extremely precarious. It's very, very difficult, for me at least, to see that Ukraine can ever get back to its earlier borders, or that it can create the status quo ante prior to Russia's attack. Russia's attack was completely illegal. It has no ground in any sort of international law. But in a funny way, does that matter? It's done it. It's occupying the Russian-speaking parts of Ukraine. It doesn't apologise for it, and it's just staying there. So Zelensky's between a rock and a hard place. Does he allow the war to continue, running risks to even further encroachment by Russia into Ukraine? Or does he settle it off, as has happened in Alsace in previous eras, as happened in Schleswig-Holstein and other places like that, where for long periods people will accept a foreign occupation because maybe one day it will revert or whatever. But it's essentially to save lives. And Ukraine has suffered enormously as a result of the Russian onslaught. So Zelensky is caught in the cleft stick of national pride and the safety and security of the Ukrainian people. A shocking place for him to be in. So he may decide that discretion here might be the better part of valour and he'll join Trelats. On the other hand, though, it could be that Zelensky has a bit more luck with Trump because, as I've said elsewhere, Emma, Trump is not really interested in the outcome. What Trump is interested in is the activity. He's interested in doing the deal, whatever the deal happens to be, because he doesn't care about what the deal is. He cares about doing it. And he certainly, I think, cares about trophies. He wants the trophy, which is the Nobel Peace Prize. He wants the trophy of being a peace dealer. He wants the trophy of being a president who could generate an outcome for whatever it's worth when nobody else could do that, irrespective of what sort of an outcome it is. And he will then claim it to be an outcome entirely different from the outcome that it is in reality. So in all of that, we're dealing with a very, very clever manipulator in the person of Vladimir Putin, a very, very clever maneuverer rather than a manipulator in the person of Vladimir Zelensky, and a less clever but deeply self-absorbed and querulous president who is perhaps more famous for being an unstable, stable genius than he is for his ability to land an enduring and viable long-term strategic outcome in Eastern Europe.
And I mean, I think that Putin in particular, as you have described him, is in a better position to take advantage of those particular characteristics in the US president, because as we've spoken about on the show before, Putin is able to speak to Trump's biggest insecurities and to the ideological project that is sitting behind Trump. And, that was made so clear in the way Putin so successfully manipulated Trump around American democracy.
Sounds like Vladimir Putin knows the right buzzwords and how to get into Donald Trump's ear.
Vladimir Putin said something, one of the most interesting things. He said, your election was rigged because you have mail-in voting. And he said that to me. It was very interesting because we talked about 2020. He said, you won that election by so much.
You pushed out on social media about doing away with mail-in ballots and potentially electronic voting machines. Can you expand on that and how important
Well, that's a very off-topic, just really quickly. Mail-in ballots are corrupt. Mail-in ballots, you can never have a real democracy with mail-in ballots because the Democrats want it. It's the only way they can get elected. Because with men and women's sports and with transgender for everybody and open borders and all of the horrible things, and now the new thing is they love crime.
One of the things to come out of that meeting between Putin and Trump was that Putin had talked to Trump about mail-in voting and about how you can't possibly have free and fair democratic elections with mail-in voting, playing to all of Trump's conspiracy theories about the 2020 election in particular. And then, we see Trump turn around and go back to DC and order up an executive order that will attempt, at least, to effectively ban mail-in voting.
That's a really important point, Emma, because, in a curious way, Trump is playing off the cues that Vladimir Putin is deftly able to sort of throw out there. I don't know, Emma, when I saw the footage of Vladimir Putin and Trump meeting in Anchorage, Alaska, Trump clapping and Putin walking along the red carpet and all of that, I was wondering whether there is such a thing as the reverse. Come into my parlour, said the spider to the fly. Because here you've got a really interesting spider in the case of Vladimir Putin and in sort of technical terms, an innocent Trump because he doesn't know what he wants, but it's in Trump's parlour. But it used to be a Russian parlour, I suppose. So there we are, a reverse come into my parlour. But I think Putin played that really brilliantly. And as I said in response to one of the earlier points you made, nobody thought that it would be a leverage point for Netanyahu in Palestine. But we've got to see that that is the nature of America's power, that what it sets as a kind of semi-precedent in one place will be picked up elsewhere and played as a precedent. And I think that always has to be thought through, not least of all by the President of the United States. And I don't think that Donald Trump really thought that bit through.
No, I suspect you're right. One of the things he is thinking through, though, if we turn back to US domestic politics now, is this catastrophic undermining of the institutions of American democracy, this project that he is engaged in, part of which is mail-in voting, part of which is a redistricting in Texas at the president's prompting, so that Republicans will pick up more seats at the midterms. Allan, we've spoken many times about the relative health of American democracy. How bad do you think it is? Will the midterm elections even happen?
I reckon you're a much better forecaster of whether the midterms will happen than I probably am, Emma. But I'd have to say I've got some doubts, but they're almost subliminal doubts, and it's only the very few cues that Trump has given according to the direction that he might go. One is the redistricting, and I think the Republicans have been brutally clever in that because so far as I understand it, there's nothing illegal in what they're doing.
No, nothing.
And equally, I think many of the Democrats, including the Texan Democrats, have been unbelievably dumb because their only form of retaliation is either to run away, go somewhere else, or even worse, to say, well, if it's sauce for the goose, it's sauce for the gander, we'll do the same. In the blue states, well, have a look at what the potential is if all the red states go doing this to counteract the rest of the blue states. It is a lay-down misere for the Republicans. There is much more in redistricting, as I understand it, in the Republican states than there is in the Democrat states. And I think that there's a big vulnerability there because it will legitimize a long-term skewing in America's political construct because they don't have compulsory voting. In fact, they don't have a lot of voting at all, really, if you look at the numbers. And so if they can get the Republicans can skew the boundaries so that there is a marked preference swung towards the Republicans, then that will have implications for America's long-term public policy and long-term political stability. The second cue, I think, Emma, that's worrying me a lot is this habit that President Trump seems to have of reaching for the six guns straight away before he starts to think and talk. And I'm very worried about his habit now of wanting to call in federal agencies to maintain domestic security, which is a state responsibility in the United States through the myriad police services, which are all constructed around state legislation, not federal legislation. And so the idea that Washington can be run by the National Guard and that Los Angeles can be run by the National Guard, the question I think we've got to ask is this a bit of signalling about the instruments that might be used to avoid having the midterms held altogether? And that worries me a lot. So when you put those two indicators together, the redistricting and this use of federal authorities to do the business of state governments, I think the signs are a bit ominous. But I'm not certain yet just whether they come together and how far they lead towards a suspension of the midterms. But I'm finding it pretty worrying.
I think it's deeply worrying, and I mean, I'd go so far as to say that it's a little bit more even than signalling. When Trump made that announcement about federalizing the DC police force, he explicitly named other cities like Chicago, like Baltimore. This is clearly a trial balloon, and as you say, when you put it in the context of that redistricting happening in Texas. That will probably also happen in, I think, Ohio and Missouri and goodness knows where else. And in the context of a ban on mail-in voting, of course, which, as you were saying, Allan, in a place where voting is already difficult, when voting is held on a Tuesday, on a work day, and people are looking at hours and hours of waiting in line, not having mail-in voting will effectively disenfranchise an awful lot of people. And in all of that context, I think it's easy to see, that either the midterms happen, but they're hopelessly compromised, or you have a president who has already done so many things straight out of the authoritarian playbook, calling some kind of an emergency and sending in the National Guard to postpone elections or whatever it may be. I think it's becoming easier and easier to imagine those
Yes, of course it
scenarios.
is. I mean, look, he won't just suspend the midterms. What he will do, I suspect, is call some kind of state of emergency. Crime is rising so fast in Baltimore, New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, and Washington that I'm now compelled to send in the National Guard. And for that reason, we'll have to postpone the midterms because people will not be safe in going to vote. So I'm really doing it in the interest of the security of the people. And I mean, I know that's fiction and imagination on my part, but honestly, Emma, it's fiction and imagination if any of us had been having these sorts of conversations a mere 5 years ago. So unfortunately, at the moment, reality in the United States is much more oppressive than fiction.
Allan, it's a very grim picture, but I think we agree, just as you were saying, that it's a realistic one, and what we're talking about really is nothing less than the collapse, partial or total, of American democracy. This is not a fair question to end on, but I'm going to ask it anyway because I'm like that. What would that mean for Australia?
Oh, Emma, it would shake the creedal nature of our belief and relationship with the United States very fundamentally, I think. And it would take us quite a long time to work our way through it. You and I, Emma, have both done a lot of work in the last few years in trying to help people understand the nature of our relationship with the United States. And it's a very deep and profound one. I mean, we are similar sorts of countries, not the same. We share a few things in common. We borrow a fair bit of history with and from each other. And it's a country with whom we've had a long and pretty affective relationship. So you don't throw that away, ever. But what you do have to do, as the relationship goes through a fairly significant change, with one partner at least in trouble, and I think the US is in trouble, is for the other partner to both understand the nature of the trouble, to talk to the partner about that trouble, and we're not doing any of that at the moment, and then to talk about how within the framework of a close, historical and long-term enduring relationship that goes out into the future, Australia is able to manage a much higher level of self-direction. How we can identify our interests, our wishes, our wants, our needs, talk to America about its wishes and interests and wants and needs, and determine the extent to which they're convergent, divergent, or whatever. But what we can't continue to do is just rest happy and secure in the massive embrace of the United States when we don't know what we're embracing, and they certainly don't care a damn about us in the embrace in which we are. They don't care a damn about their embrace of the Europeans at the moment. That is stark and clear. We just had J.D. Vance yesterday saying, well, if there's any interest in looking after the long-term security of Ukraine, then the Europeans can pay the bills. Well, it's clear that the United States doesn't understand what its interests are in the long-term security of Ukraine. It's just something that doesn't matter. Well, in my view, it really does matter if they're serious about looking at Russia as a peer competitor. It does matter. And it does cost money if you're a global leader. That's the dues you pay for being a global leader. You just can't say to everybody else, oh, well, you can meet the costs of our global leadership because it's in your interest to do so. I think there are a lot of people in Europe and a lot of people in Australia who don't think that anymore. So I think the risk is that we're not deft enough to attune ourselves to the new opportunity that we have, curiously, as a result of the election of President Trump, because it's a good thing that we should exercise a bit of self-discretion and self-direction in the further development and evolution and management of our long-term relationship with the United States. So, to the extent that the government can look at the positives in what is a pretty tricky time, the positives really are in having a pretty frank conversation amongst ourselves, a public one, so that the Americans can watch us have a frank conversation about what we want, where we want to take it. And in a funny way, there's a bit of that on in Canberra just today with the conclusion of the productivity conference. And then to get on with the business of talking to the Yanks much more, I think, constructively about where our interests and theirs might diverge as well as converge, so that we're no longer simply a convenient acolyte, but a true partner with a measure of independence and independence of advice. So I think it's actually not too bad.
It is slightly uncharacteristic of us to end on a note that is not too bad. So we might do it. Allan, it is a grim picture often, but you paint it beautifully. Thank you always, as always, for your time.
Well, Emma, I thought you might finish by telling me that I'm a real bastard.
Only off air, Allan. Oh, dear. If you want to read more from the Australia Institute, you can order the second edition in our Vantage Point series. Dead Centre, How Political Pragmatism is Killing Us by Richard Dennis explores the contradiction between centrism and evidence that sits at the heart of democratic debate in Australia. You can buy Richard's essay for $19.95 or become a subscriber to the Vantage Point series via our website, australiainstitute.org.au/store, or tap the link in the show notes. We'd love to get your thoughts on the show so far. You can send us feedback as well as episode and guest ideas to our email address, which is podcasts@australiainstitute.org.au. This episode was recorded on Friday, the 22nd of August. After America is supported by the Andrew Farron Foundation and produced by Angus Blackman. We'll be back next week. I'm Emma Shortis. Thanks for listening.